In January of 1978, a crew of professional burglars broke into a house in the Chicago suburb of River Forest, and every criminal in the city, on hearing the news, understood immediately that these men were already dead. Because the house belonged to Tony Accardo. You may not know the name, and that was the point of his entire life. Accardo had been Al Capone's bodyguard. Capone himself named him Joe Batters, for what he could do to a man with a baseball bat. By 1978, he had sat at the top of the Chicago outfit, in one form or another, for 40 years. The FBI's reckoning made him the most powerful mob figure in America, and in all that time, through 30-plus arrests, 4 federal indictments, and 3 Senate committees, he had never spent a single night in jail. Capone lasted 6 years and died broken. Accardo simply never stopped. That was the man whose home they ransacked. Accardo got the call at his winter place near Palm Springs. He did not call the police. He never called the police. When detectives found out on their own and came asking, the old man had nothing to say. The bodies started appearing within days. The crew's leader, the best alarm man in Chicago, in the trunk of his car, tortured, throat cut. His second, shot 4 times in the back of the head. Another at a hotel by O'Hare. Then their fence. Then men only loosely connected to the job. By spring, as many as 10 men tied to that one break-in were dead. No one was ever charged. No one ever is with Accardo. That's the whole story. Everyone who ever sat in the boss's chair in Chicago paid for it. Prison, exile, a bullet, Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Sam Giancana. The one man who never paid was the quiet one standing behind the chair for half a century, the whole time. This is how he did it. This is the story of the quiet king of Chicago. He was born on April 28, 1906, in the neighborhood Chicagoans called Little Sicily, the second of 6 children of an immigrant shoemaker. And it's worth pausing on that, because nothing about the household predicted what came out of it. The father mended shoes, the mother kept the home. The family was poor, devout, and unremarkable, one of thousands like it packed into the near North Side. But the neighborhood had another economy running underneath the visible one, and by 14, Antonino, Tony, had dropped out of school and found it. He ran with a street crew called the Circus Cafe Gang, named for the cafe where they gathered. Small robberies, stolen goods, the apprenticeship of the era. What separated him, even then, wasn't flamboyance. It was reliability. He did what he was asked, he did it well, and he kept his mouth shut. In an underworld full of young men auditioning for attention, the quiet ones were noticed by exactly the people who mattered. The person who noticed Tony Accardo was a man named Jack McGurn, Machine Gun. Jack McGurn, one of the most feared killers in the organization of Al Capone. McGurn recruited him, and by the late 1920s, Tony Accardo, still in his early 20s, had one of the more remarkable jobs available to a young man in America. He sat in the lobby of the Lexington Hotel, armed, as a bodyguard and driver for Al Capone himself. Think about the education that job amounted to. Capone at that moment was the most famous criminal on earth, a man who ran an empire estimated in the tens of millions a year, who gave interviews, courted photographers, fed the poor with one hand, and ordered killings with the other. From the lobby of the Lexington, young Accardo watched the greatest show in American crime from the front row. He drew 2 lessons from it. The first was how the machine worked. The breweries, the wire rooms, the aldermandurs, in the payroll, the police captains with envelopes in their desks. The second lesson was bigger, and he would spend the rest of his life applying it. Everything that made Capone famous was a mistake. The interviews, the flashbulbs, the public swagger. Fame drew the federal government the way blood draws sharks. And the federal government, unlike the Northsiders, could not be shot at or paid off forever. It is one of history's neater ironies that the man who best understood the failure of Al Capone was the kid holding his coat. We should deal honestly with the violence, because the legend and the record have gotten tangled, and the truth is disturbing enough without embellishment. The nickname came from Capone. The story, told for decades by lawmen and mob figures alike, is that Accardo used a baseball bat on men who had betrayed the organization, and did it with such finality that Capone remarked admiringly that the kid was a real Joe Batters. The name stuck for the rest of his life. Inside the outfit, to the end, the men who feared him never called him Tony or the Big Tuna. They called him Joe Batters, or simply JB. What else he did in those years is genuinely uncertain, and I'll flag that clearly. His name has been attached to some of the era's most infamous violence. The 1926 killing of Northside boss Jaime Weiss outside Holy Name Cathedral. Even the St. Valentine's Day massacre itself, where some accounts place him as one of the shooters. The FBI man who spent decades on him believed some of it, but no court ever established any of it, and historians still argue the details. What no one disputes is the reputation those stories built. By his mid-20s, Tony Accardo was understood to be a man who could administer violence calmly, professionally, and without the need to talk about it afterward. In 1931, the same year the government finally took Capone down, not for murder, but for taxes, the Chicago Crime Commission published its first official list of public enemies. Tony Accardo, age 25, came in at number 7. And here the two arcs of this story cross for the first time. Capone, the loudest man in America, went to prison and never really came back. Released years later, with his mind being destroyed by untreated syphilis, dead at 48. And the quiet bodyguard from his lobby began, step by step, to inherit the machine. There's a line about the two of them that circulated in Chicago for decades, attributed to an associate who knew both men. It's the thesis of this entire film, so I'll give it to you now. Accardo had more brains before breakfast than Capone ever had all day. To understand the system Accardo would eventually perfect, you have to watch it fail twice first. After Capone fell, the organization, now simply called the Outfit, passed to Frank Nitti, the enforcer. But the real strategic mind of the era was a soft-spoken Neapolitan named Paul Ricca, called the Waiter from his restaurant days. Ricca had absorbed the same lesson Accardo had. The man whose name is in the papers is the man who goes to prison. So Ricca preferred to stand behind Nitti, guiding things, while Nitti wore the title. Through the 30s, the Outfit did something the public barely noticed. It went national. It reached into Hollywood, taking control of the stagehands union and quietly extorting the movie studios, Fox, MGM, Paramount, for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in exchange for labor peace. It was a spectacular racket, and it worked until 1943, when two of the scheme's frontmen were caught and, facing long sentences, did the unthinkable. They talked. The indictments came down on the whole leadership. Nitti, Ricca, the top tier. And the night before Nitti was due before the grand jury, the Outfit's leaders met and informed him that since the Hollywood scheme had been his to run, he would be the one to plead guilty and absorb the sentence for everyone. Nitti, claustrophobic, by most accounts already unwell, unable to face a cell, walked to a rail yard the next day and shot himself. Ricca got 10 years, and the Outfit passed into the hands of the underboss he had chosen, Tony Accardo, age 37. Now watch what Accardo did with the lesson, because this is the pivot of the whole story. He had now seen the pattern twice. Capone, famous, imprisoned, destroyed. Nitti, titled, indicted, dead. Ricca, powerful, but caged the moment the spotlight found him. The conclusion was obvious to a man paying attention, and Accardo was always paying attention. The title itself was the trap. The government prosecuted names it could put on an organizational chart. The press hounded faces it could photograph. Power and visibility had to be separated, permanently. While Ricca sat in prison, Accardo ran the Outfit, and by every serious account, ran it brilliantly. And when Ricca was paroled in 1947, barred by his parole terms from associating with known criminals, the two men settled into the arrangement that would define Chicago for the next quarter century. A two-man Supreme Court, Ricca and Accardo, making the decisions that mattered, while other men, in time, would hold the title and take the heat. The record even preserves the flavor of how they worked. Ricca's standing instruction for eliminating a problem was a single quiet sentence. Make a him go away. No meetings, no drama. That was the culture Accardo inherited and refined. An organization run less like a street gang than like a holding company with a very unusual enforcement division. Under Accardo, the Outfit entered the most profitable era in its history, and the remarkable part is how little of it the public ever saw. His first great project was gambling, and specifically the infrastructure of gambling. Every bookmaker in America depended on one thing to operate: Fast, reliable racing results, delivered by wire. Control the wire, and you didn't need to run every betting parlor in the country. Every betting parlor paid you. It was, in modern terms, a play for the platform rather than the storefronts. The Kefauver Committee would later call the wire service the lifeblood of organized crime. Taking it required removing the man who ran it, James Reagan, who understood exactly who was coming for him and told the FBI as much. In 1946, Reagan was shot from a passing truck. He survived. He was recovering in the hospital under police guard when he died anyway. The autopsy found mercury in his system. No one was ever convicted. That killing, a hospital bed, a guarded room, poison, told Chicago everything about the new management. Patient, thorough, and utterly unconcerned with how impossible a target appeared. From there, the empire diversified the way any well-run conglomerate does. Slot machines and vending machines, seeded into gas stations, bars, and restaurants across the Midwest, with Accardo shrewd enough to invest in manufacturing the machines, not just placing them. Bootlegging, of all things, revived and shipped into the states that had stayed dry after Prohibition ended. Counterfeit tax stamps, loan sharking, the takeover by force of the enormous policy lottery rackets on the South Side. An operation a rising hoodlum named Sam Giancana ran with brutal efficiency. Remember his name? The story turns on him soon. And then there was the desert. When Las Vegas boomed, the outfit was there early and deep. Hidden points in the casinos, outfit slot machines on the floors, and above all, the skim. Cash lifted out of the counting rooms before it was ever recorded, flowing back to Chicago by courier, untaxed and invisible. In the decades that followed, the skim would be worth millions upon millions, and it was administered with the same principle as everything else Accardo touched, quietly, through layers, with the man at the top appearing nowhere on any document. Through all of this, Accardo lived in River Forest as a man whose stated occupation was, at one point, beer salesman. A big house, yes. He allowed himself that indulgence, a point we'll return to. But no interviews, no nightclubs, no headlines. When he appeared in public at all, it was under a low hat brim and dark glasses. The press, hungry for a character, had to settle for the fishing photo that gave him his second nickname, a grinning Accardo hoisting a giant tuna. Big tuna! He reportedly hated it. By 1950, the Chicago Crime Commission rated him the #1 figure in Chicago crime, and the Kefauver Committee, the Senate's first great televised investigation of the Mafia, described him as sitting at the very top of interstate organized crime. Which raises the obvious question. The government knew. Everyone knew. So, why could no one touch him? The answer is the system. And in 1957, Accardo completed it with his masterstroke. By the mid-1950s, Accardo had a problem that had nothing to do with rivals. It was the Internal Revenue Service, which had begun asking how a beer salesman financed his lifestyle. The heat was rising, and so, in 1957, Tony Accardo did the thing that separates him from every other boss in American Mafia history. At the height of his power, at just 51 years old, he stepped down. Or rather, he appeared to. The title of boss, the day-to-day authority, the visibility, all of it went to Sam Giancana, the ferocious earner who had delivered the policy rackets. Accardo took for himself a title that sounded almost humble, consigliere, counselor, elder statesman. But here is the actual architecture, and it's the thing this whole film has been building toward. In the Chicago outfit as Accardo and Ricca had designed it, the boss's chair was not the seat of power. It was the lightning rod. The man in the chair absorbed the subpoenas, the surveillance, the front pages, the indictments. The real authority, over major money, over who lived and who died, stayed with the two quiet men above the chair, whom the government could never quite fit into an org chart. Accardo hadn't retired. He had outsourced the risk of being boss while retaining the returns. It's why the FBI's own men, for decades after, kept describing Chicago the same way. Titles changed, front bosses came and went, but behind all of it sat the same man. And the government, right on schedule, proved the design correct. That same year, 1957, the state police stumbled onto the National Mafia Summit at Appalachian, New York, and the resulting scandal finally forced J. Edgar Hoover's FBI to declare war on the mob. Every boss in America went under the microscope, And whose face absorbed Chicago's share of that heat? The man in the chair, Sam Giancana, Chicago's delegate at Appalachian, and now, officially, its boss. For a while, the machine hummed, but Giancana, it turned out, was constitutionally incapable of the one discipline the system required, staying dull. He romanced a famous singer, he ran with Frank Sinatra, he got tangled, through a shared mistress, through a CIA plot against Castro, through the 1960 election itself, with the Kennedy family, a story we told in full in our film on Giancana. He became, in short, the most photographed gangster in America, trailed by FBI agents so closely they played the next tee behind him on golf courses. From River Forest, Accardo watched his lightning rod turn into a bonfire. The federal attention Giancana attracted was spilling onto the whole organization. And when Giancana was jailed for contempt in 1965 and then fled to Mexico, the two quiet men above the chair simply made a change. Giancana was out. A reliable, unglamorous man named Joey Ayupa was in. The chair got a new occupant. The power never moved an inch. 10 years later, in 1975, days before he was to testify to the U.S. Senate about the CIA's plots, Sam Giancana was shot dead in his basement kitchen. No one was ever charged. Decades on, a Chicago hitman turned government witness would tell the FBI that the killing had been sanctioned at the very top, that Accardo was part of it. The man Accardo had lifted into the chair, the man who had forgotten that the chair was borrowed, went into the ground. The system's ought. Hoare attended to the system's maintenance. If that sounds cold, consider the ledger from Accardo's side of the table. Capone died raving. Nitti died in a rail yard. Ricca did federal time twice. Giancana died over a frying pan. Ayupa, eventually, would die in prison. Every man who ever held the title paid for it. The man who declined the title, all those decades, paid nothing. Which is not to say the government didn't try. They tried for 50 years. The story of those attempts is almost comic in its futility, and it's where Accardo's discipline shows most clearly. They subpoenaed him before the Kefauver Committee in 1951. He showed up, sunglasses on, and took the fifth. They cited him for contempt. It went nowhere. Before the McClellan Committee, facing Robert Kennedy's investigators, he gave his name, his address, and then invoked the Fifth Amendment, by the count that entered legend, 172 times, 172 questions, 172 polite refusals. The performance of a man who understood that in his position, silence wasn't just a right, it was a business practice. The closest they ever came was taxes, the Capone playbook. In 1960, they convicted him over deductions that included, memorably, writing off his Mercedes as a business expense of his beer salesman career. 6 years, the sentence said. He never served a day of it. The conviction was thrown out on appeal. The courts found the press coverage had poisoned the jury, and at the retrial in 1962, he was acquitted outright. In 1982, at age 76, the government tried once more, a big labor racketeering case in Miami, where a witness named him the number one power behind a 500,000-member union. Acquitted again. Let me give you the full, honest accounting of his record, because the legend usually rounds it off. More than 30 arrests across his lifetime, at least 4 major federal indictments, the one tax conviction overturned, and against all of that, by the strictest reading, a single police lineup in February 1945, in a murder investigation where he was held for something over 24 hours, the closest Tony Accardo ever came to incarceration in 86 years of life. He boasted he never spent a night in jail. See? May accounts spot the government that one night in custody. Either way, the substance stands untouched. The man who ran or oversaw the most powerful criminal organization in America for parts of 5 decades was never once successfully imprisoned. He was even briefly drafted. In 1944, with charges pending, his lawyer told a judge the young man was eager to serve his country and shouldn't be denied. Accardo duly reported to the draft board, candidly explained his criminal background and position in the organization, and was rejected as morally unfit. The pending charges were then dropped, since he had done exactly as the court ordered. It's the whole method in miniature. Use the system's own rules, keep a straight face, walk away clean. And at home he was, by all accounts, exactly what he appeared to be. One wife, Clarice, married in 1934, for 58 years until his death. 4 children, kept entirely out of the business. No mistress scandals, no nightclub photographs. His single documented indulgence was the house. For years, a vast place in River Forest with, famously, an indoor pool and a bowling alley, which his own colleagues considered dangerously conspicuous and which he eventually, characteristically, sold in favor of something more modest. The most feared man in Chicago hosted an annual 4th of July cookout for the neighbors. There is one more domestic detail, so improbable it belongs in fiction, and it's verifiable. Decades later, his great-grandsons would play in the National Football League. 2 of them, Joey and Nick Bosa, became 2 of the most famous defensive players of their generation. The bloodline of Joe batters on television every Sunday, sacking quarterbacks. History has a sense of humor, which brings us back to the frozen January where we began, because now you have the context to understand what that burglary actually was and why the response was what it was. It started, improbably, with a favor. In the last days of December 1907, a crew of professional thieves hit a jewelry store on the near North Side. Torches through the wall, the alarm neutralized, a haul reported at around $1 million in jewels, silver, and furs. The store's owner, Harry Levinson, happened to be connected, a man under the outfit's protection. Detectives found him strikingly unhelpful. One called him the least cooperative victim he'd ever seen. Levinson didn't need detectives. He knew someone better. Word went out from River Forest, reportedly after the outfit's Las Vegas man, Tony Spilotro, himself a former burglar who knew every crew in Chicago, identified the likely culprit, a master alarm man named John Mendel. The instruction to Mendel's crew was simple: give it back, and they did. Every piece, $1 million score, surrendered on a sentence from a 71-year-old man in the desert. But Mendel seethed, and in the first days of January 1978, with Accardo away in California, he and his crew made the most catastrophically misjudged decision in the history of Chicago crime. If the old man was going to take their score, they would take something of his. They went through the alarms at 1407 Ashland Avenue and ransacked the house of Joe Batters. I gave you the aftermath at the top. Here is its precision. Mendel, the alarm genius, vanished in mid-January and was found weeks later in a car trunk, tortured, his throat cut. His second was found shot behind the wheel. Another crew member surfaced at an airport hotel. More followed through February and into spring, including the fence who'd handled their goods, and men whose connection to the job was peripheral at best. Accounts of the final toll vary between 6 and 10 dead, because the circle kept widening. This wasn't an investigation, it was an erasure. By the end, everyone who had touched the burglary, moved its proceeds, or arguably even known of it in advance, was gone. Chicago police and the FBI knew precisely what they were looking at. They charged no one, because no witness in the city of Chicago had anything to say. And then came the detail that elevates the episode from mob revenge to something closer to dark parable. A federal grand jury investigating the murders called Accardo's long-time houseman, the quiet caretaker of the Ashland Avenue property, a 75-year-old named Michael Volpe. He testified. 5 days later, Michael Volpe disappeared. He was never found. The 71-year-old man at the center of it all was never charged with so much as a parking violation in connection with any of it. The record will tell you only this. In 1978, a number of men robbed a particular house in River Forest, and within months, all of them were dead, and the man who lived in the house declined, politely, to discuss the matter. It was the last great demonstration of the system. Not a war, not a power grab, just the machine, switched on one final time, running exactly as designed. Total consequence, zero attribution. The last act is brief, because Accardo made sure it would be. He grew old the way he had lived, quietly, in the sun, splitting his years between a home outside Chicago and a condominium near Palm Springs. Around him, the world he'd built was finally being demolished. The government's new weapons, RICO prosecutions, and wired informants were doing to the Mafia everywhere what 50 years of subpoenas had failed to do to him. The Vegas skim cases of the 1980s sent the entire operating leadership of the outfit to federal prison, Joey Ayupa among them. The chair claimed its occupants, one last time. The man above the chair remained, as ever, above it. In 1984, at 78, the Senate summoned him once more. The elder statesman of American organized crime sat before the committee and offered under oath his summary of a half-centuries at the top. I have no control over anybody. It was, depending on your reading, a lie so vast it approached poetry, or the literal truth of a man who had always been careful to control everything while commanding, on paper, nothing. The hearing produced, as every hearing before it had produced, nothing at all. Tony Accardo died in the spring of '92, at 86 BC, of natural causes, his heart and a cancer finishing what no prosecutor, no rival, and no rebellion ever could. He was married 58 years. He died, as the saying goes in that world, with his shoes off. They buried him at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, a few minutes' drive, as it happens, from the mausoleum of Sam Giancana, the man who sat in his chair and paid the price of it. Weigh the two graves against each other, and you have the whole lesson. Giancana wanted the world to know his name, and the wanting killed him at 67, face up on a basement floor. Capone wanted it even more, and it destroyed him by 48. Accardo wanted precisely one thing, to be free, rich, and untouched. And he achieved it so completely that most Americans have still never heard of him. That is the paradox to leave you with. We remember Capone because he failed. Fame was the symptom of his failure. The trial, the photographs, Alcatraz, the legend. Tony Accardo succeeded, for 50 years, at the exact game Capone lost in 6, and the proof of his success is the silence around his name. In his world, the ultimate flex was never the headline. It was the fact that there wasn't any headlines at all.